The afternoon sun beat down on Redemption Gulch, baking the dust on the main street into a fine, pale powder. Inside the dusty Spur Saloon, the air was thick with the smell of stale whiskey, sweat, and Aliner's rich beef stew. Men with sun-creased faces and calloused hands sat hunched over tables, their low murmurs a constant hum beneath the lazy buzz of flies. Aliner worked behind the long wooden counter, a silent and steady presence in the chaotic establishment. Her movements were economical and graceful as she ladled stew into bowls, her focus entirely on her task. Her apron, though stained with the honest marks of flour and grease, was immaculately clean, a small bastion of order in the dusty saloon. She was respected here, not for conversation, she rarely spoke unless spoken to, but for the quiet competence that ensured every man had a hot, filling meal. A young cowboy tipped his hat. "Much obliged, Ellie. Best stew this side of the territories." She offered a small, weary smile and a nod, her eyes already on the next empty bowl. She didn't seek attention. She sought only to do her work and earn her keep. The saloon's batwing doors swung open with a sharp crack, letting in a blinding slice of afternoon light, and a woman who seemed to suck the very air out of the room. Matilda Blackwood stood framed in the doorway, her silk dress a startling splash of deep violet against the saloon's grimy browns and grays. The low hum of conversation faltered as every eye turned to her. She was the mother of James Blackwood, the man whose sprawling ranch employed half the men in the room. Her face was a mask of cold disapproval as her gaze swept over the squalor, finally landing on her son, who sat at a corner table, quietly finishing a bowl of Aliner's stew. Matilda's lips thinned into a razor line. She strode toward him, her heels clicking an angry rhythm on the floorboards, a sound as out of place as her perfume. She ignored her son completely, her piercing stare fixed on Aliner. "Is this what you're reduced to, James?" she announced, her voice carrying across the now silent room. "Eating this, peasant slop, in a place like this?" Aliner froze, her hand still holding the ladle. She kept her eyes down, her cheeks burning with shame, feeling the weight of every man's gaze. James set his spoon down slowly. "Mother," he began, his voice low and tight with warning. "This is not the time or the place." But Matilda was not listening. She sneered directly at Aliner. "Look at the state of you? Filthy." She gestured to the apron. "A disgrace to any establishment. You'd think a woman would have the decency to present herself properly." Before James could rise, Matilda's hand shot out, her fingers twisting cruelly into the fabric of Aliner's apron. The cheap, starched cotton of Aliner's apron gave way with a sound like tearing paper. A sharp, violent rip that echoed in the sudden, absolute silence of the dusty spur. For a moment, the two torn halves of the fabric hung from the ties at her waist, a stark symbol of the public violation. Matilda Blackwood let the piece in her hand fall to the dusty floorboards as if it were contaminated, a triumphant sneer twisting her lips. She had made her point. Aliner didn't flinch. She didn't cry out or cover her face in shame. Her hands, which had been clenched at her sides, slowly uncurled. Her gaze remained fixed, not on Matilda, but on a point somewhere just beyond her, her expression one of profound, weary stillness. It was the quiet dignity of a woman who had weathered storms far greater than a rich lady's tantrum. This composure, this refusal to be broken, seemed to infuriate Matilda more than any outburst could have. The silence in the saloon was heavy, thick with unspoken outrage. Jed, the bartender, stood frozen, his hand gripping a polishing rag so tightly his knuckles were white. The cowboys at the tables had stopped mid-chew, their forks hovering over their plates. They were rough men, accustomed to brawls and showdowns, but this cold, calculated cruelty was something different. It felt wrong, like watching a man kick a dog. Then, a chair scraped hard against the wood floor, the sound jolting everyone from their stupor. James Blackwood was on his feet. He wasn't fast, but his movements were deliberate, imbued with a weight that commanded attention. He took 2 long strides and positioned himself squarely between his mother and Aliner, his broad back a solid wall protecting the cook. He was several inches taller than his mother, and from Aliner's perspective, he suddenly blotted out the world. "Mother," he said, his voice dangerously low, a stark contrast to her shrill tirade. It was not a plea, but a command. "That is enough." Matilda's eyes widened, shocked at the public defiance. "James, are you defending this kitchen wench against your own mother?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. James didn't turn to look at her. His eyes found Eleanor's, and for a fleeting second, she saw an apology, a deep and genuine regret that went beyond words. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent promise. Then he turned his gaze back to his mother, his expression hardening into something she had rarely seen. "You will not speak to her that way," he stated, his voice now carrying a cold, hard edge that cut through the tension. "You will not treat anyone this way, not in my presence, not ever." The saloon held its breath, waiting for the explosion that was sure to follow. The silence in the dusty spur was no longer just an absence of noise. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Every eye was fixed on the trio at the center of the room. Matilda's face was a mask of cold fury, her knuckles white where she still clutched the torn fabric. Eleanor stood unmoving, her expression unreadable but her posture radiating a quiet, unbreakable strength. Between them stood James, a solid wall of defiance. He lowered his hand from his mother's wrist but did not step away. His voice, when it came, was not the thunderous roar many expected. It was low, calm, and carried to every corner of the saloon with chilling clarity. "Mother," he began, his gaze locked on hers, "put it down." Matilda flinched as if struck. She let the tattered piece of Eleanor's apron fall to the dusty floorboards. James then did something no one anticipated. He bent down, his tall frame stooping with a deliberate grace, and picked up the ruined cloth. He held it not as if it were trash, but as if it were a flag. He turned his head slightly, his eyes sweeping over the faces of the cowboys watching him, men who worked his land, men he knew by name. "This apron," he said, his voice resonating with a quiet power, "is a symbol of more honest work than most of us will do in a lifetime. Eleanor is here before the sun rises, stoking the fire. She's here long after we've gone, cleaning up. She serves this town, not with pronouncements and grand gestures, but with her hands, with flour and salt and heat. She provides a comfort that money can't buy and a respect that titles can't command." He finally turned his gaze fully back to his mother, his expression one of profound disappointment. A person's worth is not measured by the name they carry or the land they own. It's measured by their contribution, by the decency they show to others. By that measure, he paused, letting the weight of his words settle, Eleanor's worth is something you could not comprehend. He let the silence stretch for a heartbeat, a silence in which Matilda's arrogant cruelty hung exposed for all to see. He gently folded the torn apron and placed it on the bar near Eleanor, a gesture of restitution and respect. "We are leaving," he said to his mother. It was not a request. Matilda stood frozen, her face a storm of humiliation and rage. For the first time in her life, she had been publicly and completely defeated, not by a rival or an enemy, but by her own son. Without another word, James took her arm firmly and guided her toward the saloon doors, his back straight, leaving a room of stunned men and one quiet cook who now stood a little taller. The saloon doors swung shut with a heavy thud, cutting off the dusty street and the rigid figures of James and Matilda Blackwood. For a long moment, the silence they left behind was absolute, thick with unspoken thoughts. Eleanor stood frozen behind the bar, her knuckles white where she gripped the worn wood. Her gaze was fixed on the two torn pieces of her apron, a simple garment that now felt like the epicenter of an earthquake. Then, the spell broke. A cowboy coughed. A chair scraped against the floorboards. Sheriff Miller, a man whose face was a roadmap of long years in the Arizona sun, walked slowly to the bar. He looked at Eleanor, his expression unreadable at first, then softening into something like respect. "You holdin' up all right, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She could only manage a nod, her throat too tight for words. Gus, the burly bartender, slid a glass of water toward her. "Don't you pay her no mind," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The boss put her in her place right proper. A murmur of agreement went through the room. Men who had only ever given her a polite nod now met her eyes with solidarity. A young ranch hand, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, shuffled his feet. "Ma'am," he said awkwardly, we could all pitch in for a new apron." Eleanor finally looked up, her eyes misty. A small, watery smile touched her lips as she shook her head gently. The offer meant more than the fabric itself. She carefully gathered the torn pieces, her simple, dignified actions speaking volumes. In that moment, she wasn't just the saloon cook. She was a woman who had weathered a storm and earned the quiet allegiance of the entire room. Outside, the air was just as tense. The moment they were clear of the saloon's windows, Matilda wrenched her arm from James's grasp. "How dare you?" she hissed, her face a mask of cold fury in the fading light. "You humiliated me, in front of common laborers and dirt kickers. For a nobody who smells of grease and bacon." James's jaw was a hard line, but his voice remained steady. "I did what was right, Mother. You were cruel. That woman's dignity is worth more than your pride." "Dignity?" Matilda spat the word like poison. "We are Blackwoods. Our name is all that matters. You shamed it for a kitchen wench." "Father would have been ashamed of you today," James said, his words hitting their mark. He believed a person's worth was in their character, not their name. "A lesson you've clearly forgot." Matilda flinched. "Don't you speak of him," she snarled, her eyes narrowing to malevolent slits as she glared back at the saloon. "This isn't over. That little cook will learn what happens when you cross a Blackwood. She will regret this day." She turned and climbed into her carriage without another word, slamming the door behind her. James watched it rattle away down the dusty main street, a cold dread settling in his stomach. He had defended Eleanor, but in doing so, he knew he had just painted a target on her back. The pale morning light did little to warm Redemption Gulch the next day. A chill clung to the air, a premonition Eleanor felt deep in her bones as she walked to the saloon. The usual morning greetings from passers-by were replaced with furtive glances and hushed whispers. The story of the previous night had spread like wildfire, and she was now at its scorching center. Inside the dusty spur, Silas, the owner, was sweeping with a frantic energy that betrayed his anxiety. He was a good man, but a pragmatic one, and the Blackwood name carried enough weight to crush a small business like his. He barely met her eyes as she tied on a spare apron. The first sign of trouble came an hour later. "Henderson's boy just came by," Silas said, wiping the bar with a rag that was already clean. "Said they can't fill our meat order this week. Something about a sick herd." Eleanor's hands stilled over the dough she was kneading. Henderson's ranch bordered the Blackwood property. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a warning shot. By midday, the rumors Matilda had planted began to take root. Two well-dressed women, known associates of Matilda, made a show of peering into the saloon's window, their faces masks of theatrical disgust. "That's the one," one whispered loudly enough for patrons near the door to hear. "Caused such a scene. No shame." Finally, Silas cornered her by the cool pantry. His face was etched with worry. "Eleanor," he started, his voice low. "You're the best cook I've ever had. Business has doubled since you started. But Matilda Blackwood, she's not one to forgive. She's squeezing my suppliers. People are starting to talk. I can't afford to be on her bad side." He wasn't firing her, not yet, but the message was clear. Her position was precarious. The heavy saloon doors swung open late that afternoon, silencing the sparse crowd. It was James Blackwood. He didn't look at anyone else, his gaze fixed on Eleanor as he strode to the counter. He took off his hat, his expression unreadable. For a terrifying moment, she thought he'd come to finish what his mother had started. Instead, he spoke, his voice calm and steady, a clear counterpoint to the tension in the room. "A cup of coffee, Eleanor, please." He took a seat at a table in the center of the room, a silent, immovable presence. He didn't need to say more. His being there was a statement, a shield. He was publicly aligning himself with her, daring anyone in town, including his mother, to make a move. Eleanor's fear didn't vanish, but for the first time, a flicker of hope ignited alongside it. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption Gulch, painting the raw timber of the buildings in hues of orange and gold. Inside the dusty Spur Saloon, the air was thick with the scent of sawdust, stale beer, and the rich aroma of Aliner's beef stew simmering on the stove. This was the quiet hour, the lull between the midday rush of ranch hands and the evening crowd seeking to wash away the day's grime. Aliner moved with a practiced economy of motion in her small kitchen, her world defined by the clang of iron pots and the steady rhythm of a chopping knife. She was a woman of few words, her presence a comforting constant in the lives of the men who passed through. They knew her not by her conversation, but by the reliability of a hot meal and the quiet dignity she carried like a second apron. From her station, she could see most of the saloon. Sheriff Miller nursed a lukewarm coffee at the bar, his gaze distant. A pair of cowhands played a listless game of cards, their voices a low murmur. It was a day like any other. Then, the heavy swing doors creaked open, and a different kind of presence filled the room. It wasn't loud or boisterous, but it commanded attention all the same. James Blackwood stood for a moment, his broad shoulders seeming to shrink the doorway. The dust of the trail was on his boots, but his demeanor was all business. He didn't come to drink or socialize. He was in town for supplies for his sprawling ranch, the largest in the territory. He exchanged a brief, curt nod with Silas, the owner, before making his way to the general store across the street. As he passed the saloon window, his gaze briefly met Aliner's. There was no warmth in it, but there was a flicker of acknowledgement, a silent recognition of another person who simply did their job without fuss. Aliner felt a familiar, faint unease. It wasn't from the man himself, but from the shadow he cast, a shadow that belonged to his mother. Matilda Blackwood's reputation preceded her like a winter storm. Aliner had heard the whispers from delivery boys and merchants, a woman who believed her husband's wealth entitled her to rule the town, a woman whose sharp tongue could curdle milk. As Aliner wiped down her counter, the Blackwood carriage rattled past, its fine polish a stark contrast to the rugged town. Through the glass, she caught a fleeting glimpse of Matilda's severe profile, her lips set in a permanent line of disapproval. A cold knot formed in Aliner's stomach. It was a premonition, a quiet dread that the fragile piece of her world was about to be broken. The air in the dusty spur had been thick with unspoken tension for over a week. James Blackwood remained a silent sentinel at his table, his daily presence a quiet act of defiance. The standoff held, but everyone knew it couldn't last. The saloon doors swung open with a violence that startled the room. Matilda Blackwood stood framed in the doorway, her face a mask of cold fury. This time, she was here to end it. She marched directly to Silas behind the bar, ignoring the patrons. "I have given you enough time, Silas," she hissed, her voice cutting through the silence. "Her or your business. Your suppliers are waiting for my word. Choose now." Before Silas could stammer a reply, she turned her venom on her son. "And you, have you so lost your senses that you would choose this? This kitchen drudge over your own family? Your own mother?" Aliner stood by the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on her clean, mendied apron. Her heart pounded, but her gaze was steady. James rose slowly, his chair scraping against the floorboards. But before he could speak, a new voice broke the silence. "That's enough, Matilda," Sheriff Miller said, stepping away from the wall. His voice was calm but carried undeniable authority. Then another voice joined. It was Sarah, the blacksmith's wife, standing from her table. "Aliner is a good woman. She's one of us." One by one, others stood or voiced their agreement, gruff prospectors, weary cowboys, the town's merchants. The quiet respect they had shown Aliner in private now became a public shield. Matilda looked around, her eyes wide with disbelief, as she faced not a room of intimidated subjects, but a wall of communal defiance. The power she had wielded through fear had evaporated. James finally spoke, his voice low but carrying the weight of finality. "You see, Mother, Redemption Gulch isn't a kingdom for you to rule. It's a community. You tried to tear down a decent person, and all you did was show everyone who you really are. He looked past her, his gaze landing on Alina, filled with an admiration that went beyond protection. Utterly defeated, stripped of her authority in the very public square she sought to dominate, Matilda's face crumpled. Without another word, she turned and stormed out, the swinging doors her only angry reply. The silence she left behind was not one of fear, but of profound relief. The room erupted in quiet murmurs of approval. Silas let out a shaky breath and nodded at Alina with a grateful smile. James closed the distance between them and pulled a small, neatly wrapped package from his coat. He handed it to her. Inside was a simple, beautifully stitched white apron. "A new start," he said softly. "Thank you," Alina whispered, her voice thick with emotion. In his eyes, she saw not a savior but a partner. The torn fabric had been a symbol of her humiliation. But this new apron, offered in the presence of the community that had stood for her, was a promise of a future built on respect and quiet strength. She was no longer just the cook at the dusty spur. She was Alina, a woman who had found her place.